Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome the speaker for today, Professor Pritam Singh. So I'm thankful for me to deliver this talk on a very significant issue of eco-socialism. I welcome my colleagues at CST and the colleagues who are joined online within India and outside India. I also welcome the moderator for today's discussion, Professor Nityananda, Director, Council for Social Development. I request him to please introduce the speaker for today's discussion. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nivedita, and thank you for organizing this lecture. Thank you, Professor Pritam Singh, for agreeing to deliver this talk in CSD Forum, the Ecological Development Forum. Professor Pritam Singh has studied in JU and Oxford and has also taught in from Oxford University and other places. He has also been visiting professor many places, including jail, which many of us are familiar with. He has been working on what is known as third wave. In many situations, we get into this or that. But he always, he wrote many articles on that, on third wave, whether it's in the context of Indian third forum, whether it is in the context of other countries, whether third forum is, applicable. Here, he is going to enlighten us what could the third wave in terms of, we talk about, say, a capitalistic system of development or socialistic system of development, but do we have third wave? Because we know the problems with both the system, capitalism, which is mostly followed in the world today. And we also have seen the problem that socialist countries have to face. But he is bringing another angle to it, not just economic or social development, but about ecology and environmental issues. And we know that today's environmental problems are majorly because of the capitalist strategy of development that we have been following, because here we don't value nature or environment properly, because there is no market as such. Often you try to simulate market, but that hardly works. Now, socialism is of course talked about what private interest, what social interest. But if we look at records of socialist countries, the environment in those places also are not very great. The rivers and lakes in Soviet Union, the Caspian Sea is almost dead, and largely due to the development practices that are followed in those countries. And in today's context, when we mostly appreciate China's efforts in terms of removing poverty, in terms of becoming the factory of the world. But even China's record in terms of environment is not good. They might have resolved their city air pollution kind of that we still face today. They solved it for Beijing and Shanghai, but if you talk about other environmental issues, and especially climate change, they are also following a path that has been charted by most developed countries. So do we have any? Yes. So do we have any third way, which is, not capitalist system, but even not socialist system, but from his, title of the lecture, I feel that it will be more socialist, but it also take care of environment and ecological issues. So, which I think is a very interesting topic, and we all would be very enlightened to hear from Professor Pritam Singh. With that brief introduction, I will request you to begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I am thankful to Dr. Nivedita Sharma Singh for inviting me to this discussion, and very kind of the chair to kind of introduce as a third way, and I hope it will become more clearer as we go along. Uh, Now, I'm not very sort of sure about the knowledge on this subject in India. I know that lots of Indians, academics I interact with, they are reasonably well acquainted with global climate change because that's covered in the media. I read newspapers and journals produced from India. But I'm not very sure about what is the degree of familiarity with the concept of eco-socialism. So in my presentation, though the title is called Global Ecological Crisis, exploring the eco-socialist perspective, I will focus more on the eco-socialist perspective, but obviously will place in the context of global ecological crisis. So I think it's best to start with the PowerPoint presentation, which is only help to illustrate, but I'll expand on the points which are there in the PowerPoint. So Nivedita, if you could start with the first slide. Hello.
Can you see the slide?
I can't see any slide. No. Uh, uh,
Guarda, c'è la accendina, scusa, come vedere.
Vedi un po' come va? No, nella tasca giù. No, no, è nella busta. Dove sta la cellula? È il pacchetto di sigarette. Dentro il pacchetto di sigarette c'è la cellula.
Standing well. But since Professor Singh cannot see,
आप उनको पोस्ट बता दीजिए.
standing नहीं वो खोल के रखिए उसके बाद शेयर कीजिए. तो खोल के रखिए, then you go to the Zoom window and then share.
Previous share. So can you see the slide now?
hello.
Mr. Frequency, can you see the slide now?
No, I can't see any slide. No.
So we'll make you host and host another session.
Every time we check, it should be shared, I don't know what's wrong.
Post and make it share from this side.
Sure. Sure. Can you see? If I can check it
Good,
out.
good, good. Yes, it's come up now. Okay, so can I continue now?
Yes, sir, please.
Okay, good. Okay, so that's just the title of the talk. And let's go to the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, okay. So this is the, yeah, just go back to the previous one. Yeah, overview. So this is what I plan to cover in this lecture: global ecological crisis, and mainly two important dimensions of the global ecological crisis: global warming and biodiversity loss. And rest of the talk is basically about eco-socialism. And each slide will give that as a title, so it'll become more clearer. So looking at the first global ecological crisis. Now, normally in popular discourse, global ecological crisis is mainly equated with global warming because people can see the impact of global warming in terms of floods, drought, cyclones, all the natural, what is considered unnatural. They are not natural. The human impact is there on all of those things. But that's what is kind of popularly known as global warming, that the average temperature, average global temperature is rising compared with the pre-industrial age, and that's considered as the sign of global warming. And global warming is because of emissions of gases, and most important of them is carbon dioxide and also, of course, methane. But methane tends to dissipate after about a decade or so. So carbon dioxide, whose main source of carbon dioxide as our fossil fuels, use of petrol, gas, and so on and so forth, and coal, mainly these three. So that's the main aspect of global warming or the global ecological crisis, which is popularly known. Much less is known about the biodiversity loss. The biodiversity loss is because of the enormous diversity of species which exist in our planet. Apart from human beings, which also have huge diversity, in the non-human living world, there's a huge amount of diversity. And there has been a loss taking place in that biodiversity. And there has been a discussion, very very well-informed discussion on the level of that biodiversity loss, why that biodiversity loss is taking place, and how it is linked with the global ecological crisis. There is a link between global warming and biodiversity loss, but at the same time, there is a certain amount of autonomy also of the biodiversity loss from global warming. Because when global warming takes place, it obviously affects the area of forestation. If there are fires in the forests and lots of species get destroyed, forests get destroyed, which has impact on biodiversity loss. But biodiversity loss is more than merely the impact of global warming. Biodiversity loss has to do with human interaction with nature. And we will come to it in the later part of the discussion, that there is a difference of views among the scholars on this, whether this has the relationship between human beings and nature, which is leading to biodiversity loss, is mainly because of the development of capitalism with industrialization, and also socialist industrialization, or called socialist industrialization. or it is something to do with the human beings having become dominant even before capitalism, and that this biodiversity loss was taking place. My view is kind of in between the two. I think that biodiversity loss was taking place in pre-capitalist societies, but this biodiversity loss has been accelerated with industrialization, and we will come to this. So these are the two main aspects of the global ecological crisis: global warming and biodiversity loss. And one can see it's global ecological crisis in terms of food crisis, which again a manifestation of that, the melting of ice, the shortage of water, and droughts and so on and so forth. But that can come under the rubric of global warming. So I will now move on, to my main emphasis on socialism, eco-socialism. How does eco-socialism situate itself in this debate on the global ecological crisis manifested through these two forms, global warming and biodiversity loss? So next. Yeah. So as I see that the eco-socialism has developed as what I call creative conjunction of two perspectives on modern capitalism. That socialists criticized capitalism, but they did not pay much attention to ecology. Even in the first socialist revolution in Russia, which became Soviet Union, there was some understanding of the ecological dimension, but not very systematic. In Marx's own writings, Marx was quite aware of this, and there is a lot of work now which shows that Marx was hugely aware. And in fact, Marx started becoming aware of the ecological dimension later on in his life, not in the main work which he did in Capital, though there are many insights in Capital where he's talking about, the soil being destroyed with chemical fertilizers, the soil fertility being mentioned, and a kind of rift being taking place between nature and human beings as a result of that. But ecology wasn't really recognized. But increasingly now, socialists, and I would consider myself among them, are recognizing the importance of ecology. That the crisis of capitalism is not merely contradiction, social contradiction, that it leads to inequalities, exploitation of human beings who sell their labor power, but it's also ecological contradiction, which is a method. So those socialists are moving towards ecological socialism. On the other hand, ecologists have been recognizing the importance of protecting ecology, but many of them have also recognized that you can't protect ecology within the framework of capitalism, or there are limitations in protecting ecology in capitalism. So they are also moving towards ecological socialism. But at the same time, there is a convergence even with those moving towards each other. There are some tensions within that because they come from two different ideological, philosophical backgrounds. But nonetheless, there is a sharing of this vision that eco-socialism is the answer to the modern crisis of global economic crisis, economic and social and ecological crisis. Okay, next. Now, why it is important to qualify socialism as ecological? Why can't just leave as it used to be? One, it's the necessity. It's a differentiating from old socialism. And when I say old socialism, I mean what was claimed as socialism in Soviet Union. Many of us, and I'm one of them, do not believe that there was a socialist society in Soviet Union after about 10 years. That right from the rise of Stalinism in the late 1920s, Soviet Union has, emerged into, some people call it state capitalism, others call it degenerated worker state, but it had some features of socialism. That market had been suppressed, and there was an increasing emphasis on uh, um, planning, but that planning was oriented towards greater economic growth, greater industrialization. So in one sense, the new model, that is the old socialism, which was practiced in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and with a slight difference in China and Vietnam and Cambodia. We will come to this, that there are slight differences between them. So one, there is a necessity to differentiate from old socialism, because many people do not. I don't know that much about India, but certainly in the Western world, when you talk about socialism, it conjures up visions of what happened in Soviet Union, the mass scale slaughter of dissidents which took place, and the mass scale slaughter of the peasantry which took place in the 1930s under Stalin's regime. So eco-socialism is something which is presenting a different vision compared with the old socialist industrialization vision. And so that is one necessity. And the importance that recognizing the new era in the evolution of capitalism, that's its environmental destroying character, which I call environmental contradictions of capitalism. And I've discussed this in three of my articles, which you will find at the end in the references. So, which means that capitalism is no longer confronted with the old contradiction, which still persists, that is the social contradiction, that is contradiction between labor and capital, which manifests itself in various forms, in inequalities, in conflict between different social classes, in pauperization of the working classes, in poverty, and extreme wealth, phenomenally increased, wealth on one hand. So there is that social contradiction. But along with that, there is a very severe environmental contradiction of capitalism, that capitalism is probably not capable of solving. I'm using the word probably with this, kind of question mark, because there are some people who do argue that maybe capitalism can become green. And I'll come to that eco-socialists have a more complex and a more nuanced take on that claim, that capitalism can become green. So the importance of ecological socialism is that it's recognizing this new contradiction which has emerged, which wasn't there in such a scale during Marxist time, or even the experience of building socialism, or what they were called building of socialism in those countries. So that's the importance of this, that our era, the era in which we are living in 21st century, is characterized by this environmental contradiction. That the old contradiction, social contradiction, did not pose any threat to our planet, the planet on which we live. But the environmental contradiction of capitalism poses a challenge to the very existence of the planet, that the earth might be destroyed. I will come to that later on, which I call barbarism, a possible barbaric situation. So that's why it is necessary that we have a different vision of socialism compared with the old socialism. Okay, next. So first, looking at the eco-socialism as a critique of capitalism, and some ecologists believe in green capitalism, and there are a number of such ecologists who believe that maybe we can tinker with the markets, that market can be used as a mechanism to encourage certain forms of production and consumption activities, and discourage certain forms of production and consumption activities. They would say that, for example, if certain firms are indulging in polluting products, there can be special taxes can be levied on them in order to make a change in their behavior. Similarly, those who are producing green energy, those who are moving towards renewable energy, they can be given subsidies. So that will encourage that behavior. Similarly, they also believe that consumer behavior can also be tinkered with through market manipulation. That if public transport is made much cheaper, people will probably start using more of public transport and less use of car. And similarly, if car use is heavily taxed, and therefore, even purely from economic motives, people will probably start using less of car which, as we all know, is one of the environmental disasters or monsters of a present age. So some ecologists believe that we can use the levers of market mechanism under under capitalism to green capitalism. Now, eco-socialists recognize, and this is where eco-socialists are also different from the old style socialists. They recognize the importance of green reforms in capitalism, and I've written a long article whose reference is given in the later on, where I'm talking about the importance of green reforms in capitalism. But they argue that the fundamental limitation of capitalism remains that capital's relationship with nature. The capital's relationship with nature is such that capital is interested in using nature, whether it is land or it's water or it's forests or it's minerals. Capital's relationship with nature is primarily from the viewpoint of profit maximization. And this inner logic of capital conflicts with sustainability, that capital will like to deforest as much as possible in order to make profits. Capital will use land intensively, irrespective of the future consequences of the land degradation which might take place. Similarly, capital will like to use mines to unmine minerals, uh, irrespective of the environmental implications of that. So eco-socialists would say that there is a fundamental limitation of capitalism because of the inner logic of capital, that capital is exploitative towards nature. Capital by nature is not protective of nature. Now, one might say that capitalists can recognize that if nature doesn't exist, they can't make any profits. Okay, which is true. That it's not that there are no rational capitalists who can see that if we destroy nature, then we will not be left with the resources in the future to exploit. But that's only possible if we can imagine there's one capital all over the world, and that one capital thinking that if I have to use nature for profit maximization, it is in my interest to have that nature as sustainable. But we know, but that's not how capitalism functions. Yeah, there is no one capital. There are many capitals, and they're competing with each other. They're each looking at their own profitability, irrespective of the macro implications of that. So they might be micro rationalists, but they're macro irrationalists. That eventually they all contribute to the destruction of nature, even if their own self-interest might be involved in this. So eco-socialists recognize, and I'll come to that, the importance of green reforms in capitalism later on, that it's important to have reforms in capitalism, fight for green reforms in capitalism, because if capitalism is green, any replacement of capitalism and the form of socialism will also be green. If capitalism is dirty, and if it is replaced with socialism, even if it's replaced, that socialism will also be dirty in terms of its environmental characteristics. Okay. Next. Okay. So I also need to show eco-socialism as a critique of old style socialism. And when I say old style socialism, as I mentioned earlier, I mean as practiced in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, where the emphasis was on industrialization. And here I would not attribute only to the Stalinist stream, the Trotskyist stream, Trotsky and Provinsky, who were the left oppositionists to Stalin, they also believed in industrialization. And to a great extent, even Marx believed in industrialization. But in the last years of his life, Marx had started questioning that kind of fascination with industrialization. The reason behind previous fascination with industrialization was that industrialization will create working class, and that working class will become the agent of socialism. Because with industrialization, there will be large part of the workforce which will be only dependent upon selling their labor power. They will be divested of any property ownership, so they'll all become propertyless, and more wealth will be concentrated in few hands. So a societal structure will emerge where those who own property, they are very small in number, and those who are propertyless will be huge in number, and that will eventually create the conditions for the rise of socialism. So industrialization was seen as producing a working class, which will then undo capitalism. That's why Marx called capitalism creates its own gravediggers. By this, he means that it's in the nature of capitalism that it will lead to industrialization. But by industrialization, it's also creating a working class. That working class will eventually rise against capitalism. And this industrialization was large-scale production in industry and agriculture. And, and this was the implication of the emphasis on industrialization, that it is only the large-scale production in industry and agriculture, because it believed that large scale has economies of scale, that it is more efficient, you can employ more massive technology, therefore both in industry and agriculture. That's why collectivization in agriculture in Russia was so ruthless, because Stalin and those who supported Stalin believed that we can have modernization of agriculture only through this process, that there are large agricultural farms and you employ the most efficient technology and you increase productivity, and that's what will lead to greater agricultural output. And to some extent, that was the vision behind the three farm laws, which were introduced by the previous BJP government, against which the momentous farmers movement which arose, the most brilliant social movement to have risen in India, about which I have written and spoken quite a lot during that period. But this emphasis on industrialization and this emphasis on large scale, fascination with large scale production led to massive destruction of the environment. That Russia was as equally environmentally destructive. Russian, management of the economy was as massively destructive of environment as capitalism is destructive of the environment. Though it is also true that under socialism, they were mindful to some extent of the need for protecting nature. I was a visiting professor in Russia in 2013 in Moscow. And many people told me that Moscow has lots of very nice parks. And Stalin believed in creating these parks. And he believed that workers need to relax. And therefore they need to be close to nature. But again, this having parks for the workers to relax was motivated by increasing productivity, that the human beings can be productive only if they also relax and recreate that energy. So this was subordinated to the need of increasing industrialization and increasing productivity. Now, so that's the kind of model of socialism in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and that's more or less which was practiced in the Eastern European countries as well. And eco-socialism is very critical of that it was equally environmentally destructive, primarily because of this fascination with large scale, both in agriculture and industry. One can say that in China and in Vietnam and Cambodia, there wasn't that fascination with working class, that it was peasantry which was viewed as the revolutionary class, especially in China. Mao Zedong's practiced on that. And Kampuchea and the Khmer Rouge agrarian madness, was completely opposite of that, and an extreme version of that. And I need to mention about this Khmer Rouge agrarian madness, that Khmer Rouge, which came to power in Kampuchea, which originally known as Cambodia, they believed so much in that they thought that anything and which is industrial is destructive, and we need to have urban, rural forms of life. They were totally destructive of urban civilization, urban intellectuals, urban educational structure, and they created enormous amount of atrocities. It's massive. So one I want to say is a slight, tangential point, that it's not only the communalists who are mass murderers. It is who claim to be secularists can also be mass murderers. That capacity for mass murder is not the monopoly of those who are fascists in the old style view of one community being targeted. That's the logic of fascism. But it could be those who actually do not discriminate against any group on ethnic basis, but they have a certain view of what progress should be, and that's what lead to. And of course, what has happened in China, Vietnam, and Cambodia also is that they have moved towards industrialization, though with a slight difference. I've traveled to China and Vietnam, and actually it was quite shocking when I went to Vietnam, and there is a fascination with the USA in Hanoi, and young people, especially, and a country which has destroyed them, and they are just fascinated with the US style, and that's why the relationship between Vietnam and US is no longer hostile between that. And because the socialism which was practiced never actually looked at more fundamental critique of capitalism, and especially the environmental destruction. The recent changes in China are contradictory. As the chair also pointed out, there are some positives on ecology, but politically very authoritarian. Positives on ecology, they are laying emphasis on quality rather than quantity. They have lately realized, because the level of environmental destruction in China is unprecedented. Sometimes the air pollution is so high in Beijing that authorities had to publicly announce that people should not get out of their houses, because when they were getting out of houses, they were falling ill, and so they said that you remain within the house, and we will clear the air, and then only you are able to. So they recognize that this will not lead to economic development. If there is so much of pollution, human beings cannot work, and human beings are most critical for any kind of economic development. But along with that, it's a very politically authoritarian regime, so it can't be a model for building a democratic socialism. Cuban experience is slightly different, because when USA blockaded um, Cuba, and Soviet Union fell down, Cuba moved towards more organic agriculture, which was phenomenal, and that's one of the positive features of Cuban experiences, that they converted their backyards into organic production of fruits and vegetables, and that was quite interesting. But even Cuba was quite an authoritarian state, though not as authoritarian as Soviet Union and China. So in a criticism of this old style socialism, wherever it was practiced, we need a new vision of socialism, which is ecological, which is democratic and participatory, and also recognize the importance of small scale and indigenous communities. Now, the last 2 points are interesting: the importance of small scale and indigenous communities, that there is a virtue in small scale. And here I might mention that some of the insights of Gandhi are quite important. That Gandhi, I know that Indian scholars are aware of the difference between Gandhi and Nehru. Nehru was a giant, he believed in gigantism, that, large dams and large steel plants and so on and so forth. Gandhi had some insight about the village life or small scale production, though he wasn't scientifically informed of the importance of small scale, but he had an intuitive understanding of that. So, in that sense, he was far ahead of many other people of his time in recognizing the importance of small scale, especially small scale farming, family labor, that how this kind of small scale family labor farming is conducive to the protection of nature, because a small farmer knows every bit of their land, and they are protective of nature. In large scale agriculture, they totally mechanized, and it's not bothered about the huge amount of species involved in that. It just flattens out everything, and then that leads to destruction of land, the quality of land, the fertility of land, also the products of that land. And also indigenous communities, that the tribal communities or indigenous communities. The old socialism looked upon indigenous communities as some kind of hangover of pre-capitalist age, and one they have to die somehow or the other. No one actually theorized it, but it was kind of understood that they will be also industrialized, they will also become working class, and so on and so forth. The new vision of socialism is recognizing that these indigenous communities are very important, because these indigenous communities are very caring of their nature. And so, especially in Latin America, this new vision of ecological socialism has been laying very emphasis on indigenous communities, and has given birth to new eco-socialist movements, even some of eco-socialists coming into power in some of the Latin American countries. Again, I've covered that in one of my chapters. Okay, next. The importance of biodiversity in eco-socialism. And as I mentioned earlier, that the old style socialism did not understood the importance of biodiversity. And here it has to be in terms of human impact on nature, that there is a pre-capitalist era and the capitalist era, that it is believed that in the pre-capitalist era, there was a less biodiversity loss, but in the capitalist era, there has been a massive biodiversity loss. And there are two schools of thought within that. One is called Anthropocene, and other is called Capitalocene. The Anthropocene argues that there are geological ages in society, that there was a Holocene where all the natural changes which were taking place were taking place primarily because of natural processes. But there is a stage where human beings became more important, and it's human interaction with nature which was leading to changes in nature, and that's called Anthropocene. And in the field of geology, there has been a massive debate on whether Anthropocene is finally arrived, and I think that they're eventually going to agree on this, that we are passing through an age which is Anthropocene. But there's another school who calls it Capitalocene, that this destruction of biodiversity is mainly with the rise of capitalism. And I personally feel that this counterposing Anthropocene to Capitalocene is unnecessary exaggeration. One can say that the biodiversity loss was taking place even in pre-capitalist era, but it has been accelerated with industrialization under capitalism, especially since the 1950. And this is leading to massive scale of biodiversity destruction. That, of course, in the evolution of nature, some species do become extinct and new species emerge. But the level of biodiversity destruction which is taking place now is unprecedented. That the species who used to get lost in 100 years, they are being lost in a decade. Okay, so this is a very important feature of eco-socialism, that it recognizes the importance of biodiversity for ecological balance and sustenance of life. That biodiversity is important even for human beings. That even for human life, it is important that there is an ecological balance. Next. And there is also this idea of degrowth, zero growth, and sustainability. And I would argue that eco-socialists would argue that degrowth and zero growth in advanced capitalist countries is a very sensible position, because it's not a question of that there is enough growth in these countries. There's overgrowth, one could say even, and it is unequally distributed. And part of this growth is exploitation of the third world, and therefore what is required in these advanced capitalist countries is either a zero growth or even degrowth. But in the developed world, or in the what I call the less developed capitalist economies, there is a need for a limited and targeted growth compatible with sustainability. Now that is important, that it is not that we should start celebrating that India is having 6% growth and it's more than China. What kind of growth that is? That if that growth is not compatible with sustainability, it will become destructive. So there can be a growth where it could be through development of public transport, it could be development through renewable energy, it could be a development of more organic agriculture, and so this is also called contraction and convergence. That if degrowth takes place in the advanced capitalist economies and a limited and targeted growth takes place in the less developed countries, eventually there will be convergence, because those who have already overdeveloped, they will contract, and others will develop, and there'll be convergence on a global scale. Yeah, next. So based on that, what is the transition path to eco-socialism? As I said earlier, that eco-socialism in favor of green reforms and capitalism, because green capitalism is a better foundation for building green socialism. And one has to compare this with democratic reforms, that socialists fight for democratic reforms under capitalism, people's right to vote and fair electoral processes. One might say that it's a bourgeois democracy. Why should we fight for democracy? We fight for democracy because democracy must become embedded in the way of life. Therefore, even if capitalism is replaced, the socialism which will come will be democratic. If a society is authoritarian and socialism comes, that socialism will be also authoritarian. And the example of Soviet Union is there, that Soviet Union was a highly authoritarian society before socialist revolution. And very soon, within less than a decade, socialism also became authoritarian. So as we fight for democratic reforms under capitalism, similarly, we should support green reforms under capitalism. That is one of the kind of new insights of eco-socialism, that it is important to support those green reforms, whether in the form of energy or transportation or modes of consumption, recycling, and all the other things of green reforms. But of course, we should also recognize the limits of that green orientation, that capitalism as a whole cannot be green oriented. Parts of this can be eco. So eco-socialism is one, I would say, consistent ecological perspective. A true eco-friendly economy and society can be built only by replacing capitalism with a classless society. That it believes that it's not possible to save the planet, it's not possible to have ecological sustainability on a long-term basis under capitalism. It's only by replacing it, but by replacing it only with that kind of socialism which is compatible with ecology. And in this, role of individual intervention is very important. And I have written a chapter in a handbook, Rutledge Handbook of Eco-Socialism, in which I've emphasized the importance of individual intervention, what we do in our day-to-day life. The old style socialism did not, they only lost, paid attention to mass struggles, mass movements, but what people do in their own daily life, day-to-day life, silently and slowly. And I have written a great amount of development. That's a new kind of praxis which eco-socialism is developing. Next.
Mr. Singh, can we finish it by last 10 minutes? Okay, this is last.
Can I take for 5 more minutes?
Yes, please.
Okay. And now the imperative of eco-socialism is that there is a massive spatial shift taking place in global capitalism. The rise of China and India, to the large populated countries, and the new era in global capitalist history. This is something new which has taken place. That if you look at the history of capitalism globally, capitalism has developed in small populated countries. Okay, America is a middle-sized country. Japan is even less. Whole of Europe is very small. The biggest European country, say, Germany, is less than the population of UP. So the old style capitalist, the whole history of capitalism has been development in less populated countries. For the first time in history, this shift is taking place, that developing in large populated countries, which has huge implications in terms of the degree of resources required and the waste which is going to be produced with those resources and the environmental impact of that. So which means that if capitalism were to develop in the same form as it developed in the West, it is bound to lead to destruction of the planet. Okay, there is no way. I have written in other articles giving the example of cars, that in America the degree of car use is almost 1%, one car on an average. It doesn't mean that everyone has a car, but in China and India, it is much less. I have given figures for that, and that if they were to have the same kind of consumption style, there would not be enough spaces to park cars. And look at the implication of that car use on use of fuels and the emissions which will be created, and every car becoming a waste. Because that's one very important insight of ecology, that whatever we do, whatever we produce and consume eventually becomes a waste. And that waste has to be absorbed by the environment. And environment does not have unlimited capacity to absorb that waste. Eventually, it leads to pollution, and that pollution affects fauna. And the other is the 1.5 degree centigrade rise in average global temperature by 2030 in comparison to the pre-industrial era, which is before 1850. That the Paris climate agreement argued that if there is a 1.5 degree centigrade rise in temperature by 2030 in comparison with 1850, that might lead to a tipping point. By tipping point, we meant that there will be changes in the ecology which will be irreversible. We will not be able to do it. Now, interestingly, or worryingly, one would say, not interestingly, worryingly, 1.5 degrees centigrade has already taken place in the last year. That on average, almost close to 1.5. Some people estimate that actually it's 1.5. But of course, 1.5 degrees centigrade compared with the pre-industrial areas has to be examined over a decade. If that happens over a decade, then one can say that we have reached at that tipping point. And so there is an imperative need that this increase in temperature should be avoided, because this increase in temperature will be devastating for human life, for animal life, for all kinds of species. Okay, so that's the imperative of eco-socialism. Okay, conclusion. So one, that a significant spatial shift in global capitalism has taken place from relatively less populated countries to massively populated countries. If anyone to ask me that in the global history of capitalism, what is the most important change which has taken place, I would say this is the most important shift, which has implication for ecology. That no longer capitalism is confined to relatively less populated countries. Capitalism is expanding into hugely populated countries, and the implication of this is, enormous. Further expansion and deepening of capitalism will bring unprecedented environmental and social destruction, which I call barbarism. That we have a choice between eco-socialism or barbarism, and I'm sometimes very pessimistic that we may not be able to save the planet. That planet might be destroyed, but at the same time, one lives with hope that movements will arise and human beings learn through their own experience. So eco-socialism, consistent ecological perspective, visualizing that a true eco-friendly economy and society can be built only by replacing capitalism with a classless society. But eco-socialist transition includes micro and macro green reforms under capitalism. That by micro, even going to the point of a family, even going to the point of a single individual taking a decision about their life, how they travel, what they consume, how much do they consume, how much waste do they create, how much do they recycle. That also is important. And of course, macro green reforms, which is to do with the targets of emissions, which each country has to adopt, and whether they comply with the international standards. Next. Yeah, these are just the references, and I will lay emphasis on the first references, which is a Routledge Handbook on Eco-Socialism, and to which I have contributed an article. I think it occurs later on. And if your institute is able to get a copy of this, it will be extremely useful for those scholars who are interested in exploring this dimension, because it's an international group of scholars who's contributed to production of this Routledge Handbook on Eco-Socialism. And these various articles, I have given reference to only my own articles. That doesn't mean that I'm the sole authority on this. There are very brilliant scholars, even better than me, in eco-socialism. But I gave these because I gave reference to this in my presentation. The next. Yeah, for example, the first one, green reforms and individual intervention in the new Green Deal transition to eco-socialism, where I have brought in this new dimension that what is the importance of green reforms and what's the importance of individual interventions in day-to-day life. And the second article, which is about the ecological consequences of the rising importance of BRICS economies and presenting an eco-socialist perspective. And the last one, where I mentioned about Gandhi, it is celebrating the 50th anniversary of Shumachar's Small is Beautiful, an eco-socialist perspective. He wrote a book 50 years back. It was celebrated last year, the 50th anniversary. And this journal, Capital Nature Socialism, is the one which produced this as the main article, is a celebration of small scale, which I mentioned earlier. Thank you very much. I think I've taken more time than I should have. And thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Singh. I think all will agree that you have covered a vast ground. Capitalism or experience with that, socialism or experience with that. And of course, the ecological degradation that we have seen. And most systems so far would really give a kind of, ecologically compatible development path. But if you, of course, by, we consider other ecological economics, then it is the problem that capitalism doesn't even recognize that there is something called raw materials, not just production. So it's like in our production function, we include only capital and labor and we get everything. So obviously, in such a framework, the environmental damage is not even recognized. So, to solve the problem, the first thing that you need is to recognize the problem. So, if a framework is not able to recognize, then of course solutions become very difficult. So I probably tend to agree with you that it has to be tilted more towards socialism and capitalism to get our ecology right. I have only one question to you, and then I will ask others. Often we hear that what you are calling green reforms, those who are really hardcore ecological economists are saying these are not green reforms, but these are simply greenwashing. What would be your perspective on that? But you can come later. I will now open the floor to other, experts and academicians sitting here or online.
Yes. If I understood you right, though there is a problem in your sound, it kind of echoes so much that I don't think I would have captured everything. But if I understood right, you were asking about greenwashing. And I completely agree with you that there is a greenwashing, that many times multinational corporations proclaim to be green, and they proclaim to be green because it is in the public domain, and also the governments are giving certain subsidies, but they actually are not producing the green products. So the task of critics of multinational corporations, or the task of scholars who are engaged in this kind of task, is to expose that whitewash, greenwashing, that their claim has to be questioned, and that constantly goes on. That how companies are exposed as kind of manipulating data, or making claims, and the regulatory mechanism has to be strengthened and has to be supported. So yes, I agree with you that sometimes flimsy, sometimes actually totally wrong, and there is very little truth in that, and that both has to be constantly investigated and brought to the notice of public.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to? Yeah, Professor Mahanti, regard on you and currently distinguished Professor.
I am a great admirer of yours, Pritam. We met
Thank you.
number of times from the 1980s. I share your perspective fully. The question is, the UN-driven environment movement, about series of economic meetings, have a certain strategy which is, in my view, basically inconsistent with ecological socialism. And therefore, and it is even more complicated because India and China, you're rightly talking about the spatial shift of capitalism. India and China by 2050 will be the top two capitalist countries of the world, not otherwise. And I include China in that also, despite its many very important achievements on the environment front, but failing on the whole. And therefore, how do you see the future? Because I see a very, very bleak future. Because neoliberal economic policies, global economic trends are completely in a direction which promote capitalism in a new age, of course. Not the old style capitalism, capitalism with many new techniques of application. And therefore, do you see the struggle for green socialism, ecological socialism, giving a challenge, even an effective challenge to the kind of global trend that we are facing?
Thank you, Professor Mohanty. Very nice to see you. We're old friends. I think your question is quite a fundamental one of our age. That, as I said, the biggest change in the history of global capitalism is taking place now. That capitalism is moving from relatively less populated countries to hugely populated countries. For the first time, it is happening. And we are mentioning only about China and India, but other countries are equally important. Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, the whole of one of my students has just done a PhD thesis where we have examined the two largest countries from each of the planet in each of the three continents, China and India from Asia, and Mexico and Brazil from Latin America, and Nigeria and Ethiopia from Africa. And we've looked at the food grown in these countries under the pressure of trade, global trade, in order to earn exports, and how it's leading to environmental destruction. This will be he had just passed the thesis, and we are planning to produce this into a book to again illustrate this point that we are going through a very fundamental change in global capitalism. And this change, on one hand, when you said bleak, I also share that worry about this. That there is that it looks like unstoppable. That it's expanding, and this expanding capitalism will be destructive to the entire planet because the ruling groups in these countries are only bothered about remaining in political power. They don't think about what will be its implication in the next 50 years or 100 years, and they might create so much global emissions that eventually global warming might overshoot 1.5 degree many times more, and then we won't have this planet being able to survive. Two things which make me feel less bleak is that certain experiments in Latin America are taking place, which are different from this. That in Latin America, they openly, some, not all Latin American countries, but many of the Latin American countries are moving away from fossil fuels. For example, they are opposed to use of coal. They say keep oil in the soil, okay? And similarly, they are opposed to use of petrol, and they are moving towards more and more indigenous agriculture. Indigenous communities are becoming important. So those are quite inspiring. Secondly, that there is a worry in the capitalist class itself, that they have become also aware that we are heading to a very dangerous situation. You won't believe that the super rich of of the world are quite well informed about the environmental risk. Two things I'll bring to your notice, which may not have been covered in the Indian media. One, that the super rich of the world are buying land in one island in New Zealand, which they think will be the last place to be destroyed. And secondly, they are building bunkers, deep bunkers. They say that they will go into those bunkers along with their families, and they will have enough material to survive. The earth might be, destroyed above. And of course, these are fantasies. But of course, there is a thriving bunker industry which has developed. So there is worry about this, and this might lead to change. Uh, Biden's climate policies are quite interesting. I don't know how much they have been covered in India, and they're quite ambitious in many ways. He's not good in all the things, but in terms of environment, he's taking good initiatives, though sometimes making compromises as well. So I would think that there's a growing awareness, especially among the younger generation, because it is the future generations whose life is at stake, not the people like us. We will go away from this world, but it's our children and grandchildren who are going to live on this. They are becoming increasingly aware that we need to fight for a better future. So that gives me hope compared with the bleakness which emerges if we think only about the expanding capitalism in more developed countries, which will lead to environmental stress on resources and resource use and pollution.
We have some questions from online participants. Can you repeat the result?
So the first question is from Dr. Sushmita Mitra. She is faculty here at CSC. She's asked, as we know, climate change exacerbates gender inequalities. I want to know what framework eco-socialism provides for gender-sensitive climate resilience and adaptation strategies. There's another question from Professor Paramjeet Singh. Vietnam youth fascination with American life. We are also seeing this among Indian tribal youth such as Myanmar. What should we make out of it? Failure of eco-socialism like ideology or over-influence of capitalism? What is the answer? How to tackle this? There is one question from Aditya. In India, ecotourism in Tiger Reserve is basically state managed and it progressively limits indigenous way of life as regards access to forest. On the other hand, they are absorbed as workers in community kitchens for tourists and some kind of welfare activities. Individual intervention, any committee to locally organized for waste management can't be recognized by the state. Such mergers is sometimes to be generated in these settings. How the state can give space to individual or community intervention? The state is only interested in absorbing as workers.
I must say that there is an echo in your system which doesn't let me understand everything which you are saying. For example, the last question, the last
See
comment.
those questions in your computer.
Oh, let me see. Let me see. Okay, okay. Right. If they are there in the chats, I will be able to see them. Okay, yeah. I can see that. Susmita Mitra, thank you for sitting for such an insightful lecture. As we know, climate change exacerbates gender inequalities. I want to know what framework the solution provided gender-sensitive climates resilience. Excellent question. I'm glad Susmita Mitra asked this question, because it's very interesting that the green movements which are rising in the Western countries, I hope it will rise in India also, and it should rise. Women are on the lead. That, in fact, the leadership, whether it is UK or Germany or Austria, the leadership of the green movements, green parties is in the hands of women. And because, sometimes people make a kind of fundamentalist that women are more prone to protective of nature because of their own gender, and they are more close to nature. It could be that, but I don't have any definite views on this. But it is absolutely right that there is it's called ecofeminism, that ecofeminists are in the vanguard of the green movement. And therefore, eco-socialism plays a very important role, central role for women organizing themselves, especially because eco-socialism recognizes what you do within the household, within the confines and there women play a very, very important role in what you consume, what you waste, how much you recycle or reuse, and individual behavior which takes place, what kind of products you buy, organic or inorganic. Women have very important role to play, and so I would say that women are very central, more central than it was in the old style socialism in the eco-socialist perspective. Paramjit Singh's question, Vietnamese youth fascination with American life. We are also saying in the tribal youth, what should we make out of failure of eco-socialism like ideology or over influence of capitalism? What is the answer? How to tackle this? Well, it is obviously, that I mean, we are hearing the news about Noam Chomsky's serious illness, though he's recovering. People are circulating that he's died. He has not died. He used this word manufacturing consent. That media constantly places the fashionable aspect of capitalism. New modern products, gadgets, and the beauty of seductive presence of the bourgeois way of life, and that does convey to the youth that that's what is desirable. And new products are being produced, new clothes, new household products, new cars, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I would say, I don't know about in India, but I do see that even in India, as far as I know, that there is a section of the youth which is reacting against this. That we don't want to be prisoners of capitalist consumerism. That we need to shape a new future, and it especially came up in the farmers movement who tried to kind of revolt against this, and so there are elements of that as well. Obviously, eco-socialist thought has not penetrated, in India. I think it's a very minor current, if it is there. In China, very interestingly, they are very fascinated with eco-socialism. I mean, I have been invited to China to give talks, and I also address meetings of Chinese planners who come for training, and they are just fascinated. I have spoken on a similar subject too, and they are top officials. They who come for training, and they are fascinated with the idea of eco-socialism. So increasingly there are people in the younger people. I by younger people I mean who are in the middle age or younger age, early careers, who are becoming conscious that our future depends upon saving our planet, and they are so. This the answer to your question is, what is the answer? How to tackle is to take this idea as much as possible through your intellectual work. I mean, I'm addressing the intellectual, so that's what we can do, and to associate with those movements, and as far as I know, farmers movement was one of those. It disappointed many of us, that they did not carry on similarly later on, but it was illustrative of what can emerge, and if they are, then Aditya has a question on eco-tourism and tiger reserve, basically state managed and progressively limit indigenous ways of life as regards access to forest. On the other hand, they are absorbed as workers in community kitchens or tourists and some kind of welfare activities. Let me see what else is there in that. Individual intervention, any committee, such emergence and sometimes sui generis in these settings. How the state can give space to individual community intervention where state is only interested in absorbing workers? No, I think it's the ecotourism is interesting a subject to reflect on. One, in general, excessive tourism is destructive of the environment. And this has been proved one after the other, that those who promote tourism are big tourist companies, big multinational corporations who are interested in making profits from people being housed in the hotel industry or in the eating industry, in the restaurants and so on and so forth. But that leads to destruction of the environment in that particular communities. And many places, local communities are opposing it. Barcelona is one example. Barcelona is considered a very touristy place in Spain, and lots of Western tourists go there. And the local people are now protesting that we don't want more tourists to come here, you know. And the government has been forced to impose a levy on everyone who will enter there, have to give a certain amount of levy, £5 or £10, or something like that. So and the tourism has to be looked very, very critically. You can't just celebrate it. A limited amount of exposure to places of ecological beauty is important because that will make people aware of the importance and the beauty of preserving nature. But excessive promotion of ecotourism is more business oriented rather than protective of the environment.
One question. So we have come to the end of the today's session and we have no other questions. So I would request Nivedita to propose the topics.
Thank you, Professor Pritam Singh, for such a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, sir. We are honored to have you as a speaker. I would also like to thank wonderful audience at CSD and also the online audience for such an insightful discussion. Thank you, everyone.
And Professor Singh, it's my invitation to you whenever you come to Delhi next, please visit us.
Yes, yes, all.
Yes, certainly. I don't have immediate plan of coming to India, but I will let Nivedita know when I plan to come, and I would very much like to meet all of you and maybe have another discussion. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to ask if this will be available later on as a video to be distributed, because many people have asked that who could not join, that they would want to listen to the recording.
Share the video.
It will be available as a YouTube video.
Yes,
Hello? I couldn't get your answer, Nivedita.
so it will be available.
It will be available. Okay. Send me the link when it's available, and I will circulate through my own media.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was really enjoyable and very good questions. And thank you for your appreciation. Thanks a lot.